James Red Callahan and Liam Knuckles O'Reilly were kings of Liverpool's East End, feared, respected, and untouchable. But one missing shipment would turn friends into enemies, spark a deadly war, and drag the entire city into a nightmare of blood and betrayal. This is the story of the feud that no one saw coming, and no one could escape. Liverpool had always been a city of contrasts. Its waterfront gleamed with cranes and shipping containers, a symbol of trade and progress, yet its alleyways and side streets held secrets darker than the night. By 2010, the docks were not just a hub for commerce. They had become the stage for a hidden war. Two rival crews, both claiming roots in Liverpool's East End, had operated quietly for years, each carving out territory, building networks and managing their operations without drawing too much attention. The crews had coexisted in a fragile balance, a silent agreement that neither would cross certain lines, but that balance was about to shatter. The catalyst was a shipment that disappeared without a trace. It wasn't a small haul, this was a carefully orchestrated operation, a load of contraband worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were doing. The disappearance sparked immediate suspicion. Both crews pointed fingers, each accusing the other of betrayal. Rumors swirled through Liverpool's underground like wildfire. In the shadows of warehouses and abandoned factories, whispered conversations turned to arguments, and arguments to threats. At first, authorities dismissed the situation as a petty dispute. Missing shipments and threats were nothing new to the city, and the police assumed it would blow over. But the truth was far more sinister. Surveillance cameras caught glimpses of shadowy figures moving near the docks at odd hours, faces obscured, identities hidden. People who were normally cautious suddenly acted recklessly. There were sightings of unmarked cars, strangers asking questions that seemed too precise to be innocent. It was a subtle escalation, one that most people on the outside would never notice. But inside the world of Liverpool's gangs, it was a sign that the old rules no longer applied. The tension didn't remain confined to warehouses or backstreets. Ordinary citizens began noticing the signs, graffiti marking territories, an unusual number of armed men loitering near pubs, and a general feeling of unease that seemed to settle over certain neighborhoods. For some, it was the first hint that a quiet war was brewing, just beneath the surface of everyday life. For others, it was too late to escape its reach. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the complexity of alliances. Neither crew was monolithic. Within each group, loyalties were shifting, driven by money, pride, and old grudges. Some members were deeply loyal, others opportunistic, ready to switch sides if the price was right. This internal instability meant that even a minor incident could trigger a chain reaction, a single spark igniting a series of violent reprisals. The disappearance of the shipment was exactly that spark. As weeks passed, the feud grew in intensity. Both crews began gathering intelligence, shadowing each other, learning weakness and secrets. Safe houses were reinforced, phone lines monitored, and messages coded. The city's underworld had entered a new phase, one in which paranoia and aggression fueled each action, where no one could trust anyone else and where the smallest mistake could be fatal. By the end of the year, Liverpool's East End was no longer just a collection of neighborhoods. It had become a tense battleground. The feud that began with a missing shipment had unleashed forces that neither side could fully control. Ordinary life continued on the surface, but beneath it, a dangerous game of power and revenge was unfolding, setting the stage for a conflict that would soon spiral into bloodshed. The city was teetering on the edge, and nobody yet knew just how far the violence would go or who would survive it. By early 2011, the tension in Liverpool had reached a breaking point. What had begun as a missing shipment and whispered threats was now spilling into the streets in the most brutal way imaginable. One cold February morning, the body of a senior member of one of the crews was discovered on a quiet suburban street, far from the docks where most of the city's criminal activity took place. The killing was precise, almost surgical, leaving investigators and residents alike stunned. There were no signs of struggle, no frantic calls for help, just the eerie aftermath of a life extinguished with ruthless efficiency. The message was clear: no one was safe, and the feud had escalated to a deadly new level. The murder sent shockwaves through the underworld. Rival crews quickly realized that this was not a crime of opportunity or random violence. It was a calculated warning. The killer had chosen the victim carefully, someone whose influence and reputation had made them a symbol of power within their crew. By taking them out, the rival faction demonstrated that status and loyalty offered no protection. Within hours, rumors began to circulate that more attacks were imminent. Fear began to replace caution as the city's criminal networks braced for retaliation. For the general public, the sudden spike in violence was alarming. Streets that had been considered safe were now patrolled with suspicion. Local businesses began installing extra security, wary of becoming collateral damage. The media picked up the story, dubbing the escalating conflict the Liverpool Blood War. Headlines spoke of shootings, mysterious disappearances, and the rising tension between rival gangs, fueling both fear and fascination across the city. Residents felt trapped in a war they had no part in, yet whose consequences were impossible to ignore. As the feud intensified, both crews became more strategic. Small-time skirmishes evolved into coordinated attacks, each designed to undermine the other while minimizing the risk to one's own members. Safe houses were fortified with locks, cameras, and hidden escape routes. Informants were planted within rival crews, feeding information that could be turned into leverage or used to plan the next strike. What had once been a relatively quiet, localized turf dispute had transformed into a complex, citywide game of strategy, secrecy, and survival. But the escalation was not one-sided. One crew, stung by the loss of their leader, began recruiting heavily, bringing in younger members willing to do whatever it took to restore their reputation. Weapons more lethal than previously seen on Liverpool's streets appeared. Firearms, knives, and even improvised explosives. Each act of revenge prompted another in return, a cycle that left the city's law enforcement scrambling to keep up. The police struggled to anticipate the next move, hampered by the secrecy, the loyalty shifts, and the constant flow of misinformation designed to confuse and intimidate. In an unexpected twist, investigators discovered that the murder had been more than just a warning. It was a carefully orchestrated trap. Surveillance footage revealed that the victim had been lured from a secure location under false pretenses, indicating that someone close to them had betrayed their trust. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crew, creating paranoia that spread like a virus. Members began doubting one another. Alliances fractured, and internal conflicts threatened to destabilize the group from within. The feud was no longer simply between two rival crews. It had become a tangled web of suspicion, betrayal, and retribution that few could navigate safely. By the end of 2011, Liverpool was no longer just a city. It was a landscape of fear and uncertainty. The first killing had set the tone for a war that was just beginning. A conflict in which every move was deadly, every alliance fragile, and every resident a potential witness or a victim. The city had entered a new chapter in its criminal history, one that would leave scars both visible and hidden for years to come, and no one could predict just how far the bloodshed would go. By mid-2012, the Liverpool feud had entered a dangerous new phase. The initial acts of violence had left the city reeling, but what came next was far more insidious. It wasn't the bullets or the public shootouts that shocked investigators and rival gangs alike. It was betrayal from within. One of the most trusted lieutenants in the original crew, a figure respected for loyalty and cunning, had secretly been feeding information to the rival faction for months. The revelation stunned everyone who had thought they understood the rules of the feud. In a world already defined by deception and violence, this internal betrayal was a dangerous and destabilizing force. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Armed with insider knowledge, the rival crew orchestrated a massive heist that left their opponents nearly bankrupt overnight. Safe houses that were believed secure were raided or rendered useless. Supply lines were cut, and hidden assets vanished. The betrayal went beyond material loss. It struck at the very heart of the crew's trust and cohesion. Suddenly, members who had once believed in their leadership began questioning every instruction, every plan, every alliance. The internal instability was as dangerous as the external threat, and in many ways, even more unpredictable. What made the betrayal particularly devastating was its subtlety. For months, the lieutenant had carefully cultivated trust, feeding small bits of information that seemed harmless, while slowly unraveling the crew from within. Surveillance, financial records, and even personal secrets, all meticulously gathered, were passed along to the rival faction. Each stolen detail was like a domino, and soon the dominoes fell in a chain reaction. Within weeks, the power balance that had defined the feud since the first missing shipment had been completely upended. The fallout went beyond the criminal underworld. Ordinary citizens, already on edge from previous attacks, began noticing new signs danger. Neighborhoods that had been quiet became hotspots for sudden, unexplained violence. Cars abandoned in the middle of streets, fires started in the dead of night, and shadows moving where no one should be. Liverpool's residents, once merely observers, became involuntary witnesses to the consequences of hidden treachery. The city itself seemed to reflect the chaos, a maze of alleys and warehouses echoing the uncertainty and fear now gripping its streets. Meanwhile, the betrayed crew struggled to regroup. They attempted to identify the traitor, but mistrust ran so deep that even loyal members were treated with suspicion. Plans that had once been executed with precision now failed under the weight of paranoia. Every decision, every movement, had to be measured against the possibility of further betrayal. In this environment, mistakes became deadly, and hesitation could cost lives. The war had moved beyond mere competition. It had become a test of survival, where both external enemies and internal treachery posed equal threats. In a cruel twist, with precision, now failed under the weight of paranoia. Every decision, every movement, had to be measured against the possibility of further betrayal. In this environment, mistakes became deadly, and hesitation could cost lives. The war had moved beyond mere competition. It had become a test of survival, where both external enemies and internal treachery posed equal threats. In a cruel twist, the lieutenant who had orchestrated the betrayal was never fully exposed. The rival crew used the information to dominate the feud while keeping the mole's identity hidden, ensuring continued chaos and distrust. Their advantage was not only tactical but psychological. The sense of omnipresent betrayal, the idea that no one could truly be trusted, weakened the opposing crew more than any single attack ever could. The feud was no longer a battle over territory or resources. It had become a war fought inside minds, a relentless psychological warfare that left everyone vulnerable. By the end of 2012, the Liverpool feud had transformed yet again. What had started as a competition for power had evolved into something more dangerous, an unpredictable, self-consuming conflict, fueled by distrust, deception, and greed. The streets of Liverpool had become a stage for a deadly game in which every player was at risk, and the rules no longer applied. In this environment, survival depended not on strength alone, but on cunning, vigilance, and the ability to anticipate betrayal that could come from the most trusted ally. The city had never seen a threat like this before, and the story was far from over. By 2013, the Liverpool feud had grown beyond the docks and warehouses of the East End. What had once been a territorial dispute between two rival crews had evolved into a full-scale gang war that spread across neighborhoods, suburbs, and even nearby towns in Merseyside. The violence no longer stayed hidden in the shadows. It began to erupt in public spaces, making the city itself feel like a battlefield. Residents who had once walked familiar streets without fear now avoided certain areas entirely, wary of the next act of violence that could strike without warning. The escalation was marked by an alarming increase in the scale and sophistication of attacks. Drive-by shootings became common, arson targeted businesses and homes associated with rival factions, and intimidation tactics were employed to control neighborhoods. The crews were no longer just fighting for territory, they were fighting for survival and dominance, ensuring that every move they made would weaken the opposition, while asserting control over the city's criminal landscape. law enforcement struggled to keep pace with the chaos. Even with increased patrols and surveillance, the gang's knowledge of the city and their ability to strike quickly made them elusive and deadly. The war's reach extended beyond the original players. Ordinary citizens became unintended witnesses, victims and even pawns in the conflict. Businesses unknowingly connected to one crew faced destruction. Residents found themselves caught in crossfires, or pressured to provide information. The violence was no longer isolated. It had infiltrated daily life, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that extended far beyond the criminal underworld. Parents kept children home from school in affected areas, and neighborhoods once thriving now resembled ghost towns. In an unexpected twist, investigators discovered that the feud had begun to target individuals previously considered unrelated to the gangs. A seemingly legitimate businessman was shot at outside his office, a terrifying revelation that the feud had grown indiscriminate. Police investigations revealed that he had unknowingly supplied resources that one crew had exploited, making him a target despite his lack of direct involvement. This marked a turning point. The war was no longer just a series of tit-for-tat attacks. It was a sprawling conflict in which anyone connected, however loosely, could be drawn into the violence. The crews themselves became more ruthless, employing tactics that blurred the lines between strategy and terror. Intelligence gathering became a central focus, with spies and informants planted deep within rival networks. Safe houses were reinforced with new security measures, weapons stockpiled, and movements carefully choreographed to avoid detection. Every attack, every act of retaliation, was calculated to send a message while minimizing risk to one's own members. Yet despite this planning, chaos reigned. A single misstep could result in a deadly counterattack, and the cycle of revenge seemed impossible to break. As the city became a chessboard of deadly maneuvers, law enforcement faced unprecedented pressure. Multiple departments coordinated sting operations, surveillance and raids. Yet each attempt at intervention was met with carefully planned evasion. The gangs had learned to anticipate police actions, making arrests and seizures increasingly difficult. The war was no longer just a criminal dispute. It had become a contest of wits and resources, a relentless struggle in which the stakes were life and death. By the end of 2013, Liverpool was a city transformed. Streets were scarred with signs of conflict, communities fractured, and the public lived under a cloud of constant anxiety. The feud had grown from a local dispute into a sprawling, unpredictable war with devastating consequences. What began as a single missing shipment had spiraled into a relentless cycle of violence that touched everyone, leaving the city teetering on the edge. The gangs had proven that no one was untouchable, and the question remained, how far would the violence go before the cycle of revenge consumed them all? By 2015, the deadly feud that had gripped Liverpool for years finally showed signs of slowing, but the cost had been staggering. Dozens of lives had been lost, countless others ruined, and the city itself bore the marks of a conflict that seemed unstoppable. What had started with a missing shipment and a single act of violence had spiraled into a war that touched every corner of the East End and beyond. Neighborhoods were scarred, businesses destroyed, and families forced to flee, leaving behind homes filled with memories and silence. Yet amid the chaos, a fragile peace began to take shape, not through reconciliation, but through exhaustion and fear. The turning point came as law enforcement managed to capture or neutralize several key leaders from both crews. With their guidance gone, the remaining members found it increasingly difficult to coordinate attacks or maintain influence. Many younger recruits were arrested, killed, or disappeared entirely, leaving a vacuum that neither side could immediately fill. The violent momentum that had driven the feud for years began to falter. Streets that had once been scenes of daily confrontation grew quiet, and the constant tension that had gripped residents slowly began to lift. But the war's end was far from clean or conclusive. Even as arrests were made, hidden alliances and secret deals ensured that the underworld remained fractured and unpredictable. Some members quietly shifted loyalties, others disappeared into the shadows, and rumors of new, smaller factions forming began to circulate. The fragile peace was maintained not by justice or resolution, but by fear, fear of retaliation, fear of exposure, and fear of reigniting the violence that had already claimed so much. In this sense, the feud never truly ended. It merely went underground, leaving an uneasy calm in its wake. The psychological impact on the city was profound. Communities that had survived the violence were left with a lingering sense of vulnerability. Residents remained wary, knowing that the streets they walked every day had once been battlegrounds. Ordinary citizens who had been caught in the crossfire carried memories of terror, loss and uncertainty that would not fade with the decline in shootings or arson. Liverpool had survived the gang war, but it bore invisible scars that would shape the city's social and cultural landscape for years to come. In addition to the human toll, the feud exposed deep weaknesses in law enforcement and community structures. Investigations revealed that the gangs had been able to exploit gaps in surveillance, intelligence, and social programs, allowing them to operate for years with a degree of impunity. The war highlighted the need for better coordination, both within the police force and between law enforcement and the communities they served. It became clear that preventing a similar conflict in the future would require not only arrests, but a broader approach to the social and economic conditions that had allowed the gangs to flourish. Even as peace settled over Liverpool, a sense of caution lingered. The surviving gang members and those who had hated law enforcement quietly monitored the streets, ensuring that no single faction regained enough power to dominate the underworld. Rumors persisted of secret meetings, new alliances, and quiet retribution for past betrayals. The city had been forced to adapt, to live with the knowledge that the violence could return at any moment, and that the legacy of the feud would remain etched in the memory of those who survived it. By the end of 2015, the city had emerged from the feud, battered but intact. Liverpool had endured a war that had tested its resilience, exposing the dark heart of its underworld and the vulnerabilities of its communities. The streets were quieter, but the lessons of the gang war lingered. Power is fragile, loyalty is fleeting, and violence leaves marks that neither time nor law can fully erase. The feud that had once threatened to consume the city had finally been contained, but its shadows would remain, a constant reminder of how quickly a spark in the shadows can ignite a deadly fire.